Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Hi, everyone. Today, my guest is Belle Walker, founder and CEO of Belleview Consulting. And today, we're going to be talking about the importance of structure and process for scalable and sustainable growth. Welcome, Belle.
Thank you, Steve. It is a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah. So again, the question that I ask every one of my guests, the first question is, how did you get here? Tell us your story. What drives Belle Walker?
Well, I usually start by saying that I have an engineering background, mechanical undergrad, systems engineering, graduate school, but I'm something of an accidental engineer. I come from a family that's full of engineers, and so my big rebellion in choosing a major was to do mechanical engineering as opposed to electrical or computers, which have been the last couple generations, last 4 or 5 engineers. And so but left to my own devices and probably any other family, I would have been more on the people side. That's always been what fascinates me. And I was very involved in theater and in the arts all through college. And so when I finally emerged out into the working world, I did not end up working directly as an engineer and went instead straight into project management and actually building an operation, at the time, an aerial photography operation. So a lot of complexities there around how all of the structures and org design and policies and practices and different relationships between entities were in place. And I pretty quickly realized that a lot of the mechanical engineering concepts still applied, right? When you're talking about an org structure, there were still a lot of the sort of basic tenets around where you needed strength and where you had tension-bearing members. The difference was you were talking about
leverage,
people.
For example.
And leverage, yes. That is a very real translation. And a lot of the terminology people would use was very similar. I would hear leaders talking about having a single point of failure on their team. But the main difference was that when they talked about a single point of failure in their code or in their engineering design, it was a big deal. And when they would say, "Oh, Steve is my single point of failure on my team," then they would go finish their coffee and move on, which struck me as a little odd. And so when I went back to grad school, I did systems engineering and looked very specifically at organizations as systems. And again, the principles applied pretty smoothly as long as you don't fall into the scientific management trap. Scientific management being the concept that people are interchangeable cogs in a machine, which they are not.
Nope.
Also, cogs are not interchangeable. You can't just swap the gears in your watch and expect it to keep working. So if you really take an engineering approach and dig in on what are your constraints, what are your resources, what are the strengths, what are the gaps, most of the principles translate really well. So that inspired me to start consulting in the kind of work I do. But I very quickly got cold feet and decided to go actually build more teams and put these concepts into practice. So I did that for about another decade, building all sorts of different organizations, and then turned to the consulting full time.
Yeah. So what is it that you really specialize in here? We said the structure and process. So that's a pretty broad term. So what are the kinds of structures and processes that you find are most helpful for scaling businesses?
Ooh, So I'm going to split that question a little bit and talk about the types of structures and processes that I work on versus what may or may not be the most helpful for an organization.
Okay.
Because I would say for most organizations, the 30-second summary of what you do, that's probably the process that's most helpful. And that is often not what I am involved in. What I'm really engaged in is, kind of everything around that core expertise that the business owners are bringing to the table. So from a structures perspective, I'm usually talking about operating models, and that means uh, how your roles, your responsibilities, your org design is all laid out, but I'm not talking about putting names in boxes, right? It's really looking at what the business needs are so that you have a framework that serves your business that then you bring the people into and modify. Also looking at things like the cross-functional touch points so that you don't accidentally create a bunch of silos that never speak to each other ever again. All those pieces for the operating model. On the
Yeah.
process side, I do a fair amount of process mapping and process optimization, which can help with training and, strangely enough, profit, as you might be aware of. The more effective and efficient you can be, the better. In many cases, the challenge is often articulating the ownership, because my experience has been that business owners, especially in some of the early stages, but even over time, hiring managers, more often than not, hire good people. What is not always clear is which of those good people are supposed to be doing what steps of the process, who actually gets to be the decision makers, what the handoff points are, all those fun things that go beyond any one individual's expertise or motivation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the ways in which I coach people is trying to figure out who owes what to whom, right? And that's the same kind of thing that you're talking about here, right? Is you have things that you're expecting to get from different departments, and you have things that that you're planning to deliver to different people in the organization, whether it's departments or individuals, doesn't really matter. But who owes what to who, and who is expecting to get what from whom, and it sounds like you have a similar kind of operating model there, that you look at the process of how things are developed. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think that's fairly well described. For me. Often, what I'm trying to do with my clients, and I wouldn't be surprised if you're doing very similar work in your coaching, is really digging down to some basic philosophical guidelines that can be used to create those expectations. And so you don't necessarily need to know every single relationship to be able to make a guess about what the relationship would be. And an example of that I can give is a nonprofit fund that I worked with fairly recently that had grown beyond grant making very organically. And so they had a lot of really passionate people doing different things, and when I started working with them, they had a whole bunch of their senior leadership team all developing these strong relationships with people sending money into the organization that was being earmarked. They were all leading different programs. They were all running different departments. And so, for any one staff member who they were supposed to be looking to for guidance around restrictions on their funding, or expectations for program delivery, or expectations up their reporting line, could be completely different person to person.
Sure.
And so we took a step back and laid out some clearer guidelines around, especially at the executive level, what are those funding relationships? What are those operating sort of policy ownership levels where the program guidance was coming from? And that went a very long way to helping clarify who does what when.
Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing that you talked about was the structural piece. And I know one of the things that many of my clients struggle with, is, who's accountable for what, who's responsible for what. And when I do the first accountability chart, which is it's a sort of an EOS kind of thing, right? The entrepreneurial operating system, for those of you who are not in the know. the, what happens is that the CEO or the business owner's name is in every box. And of course, that's not a scalable model. So talk a little bit about the accountability and how you handle those kinds of things functionally.
Yeah, and that often accountability is at the heart of some of those philosophical guidelines I'm articulating. And so I do believe that, right, everything does trace up to the CEO, and there is a distinction between the buck stops here, and this is where the decision making is, this is where the coaching is, this is where the guidance is. So um, when we talk about accountability at the sort of what I think of as the vertical level, so what defines a team either at the executive level or down farther into the organization, I tend to talk about that in terms of the scope of the accountability. So in an engineering example, the kinds of things we might talk about might be, do your engineers and your product managers report up to the same executive, or do you have an executive who owns each? Which the answer to that often depends on where the natural tension happens to be in your business. If the natural tension is between those joint functions and somewhere else, then they should probably have one senior leader. If that is your core tension as an organization, you need independent leaders at that executive level. But the same carries through down farther into the organization. For non-engineers, sales and marketing is often a good example. Sometimes those are the same functions, sometimes those are different functions. My goal is to make that choice conscious on the part of the owner or CEO versus defaulting based on the expertise of who happens to be in one or both of those seats at any given moment. So that helps with accountability, kind of with that vertical separation, but you also need to look at seniority. What kinds of expectations are you putting on people at different levels of experience, different salary ranges, for lack of a better reference? Because I see a lot of leaders who are piling very discrete frontline decision making tasks on the same leaders they're also asking to own entire P&Ls or make these very strategic decisions, and aren't thinking about the capacity, the context shifting, the challenges. And so being very clear about how you can sort of split some of those mental loads so that people can have most of their time in the same, 30,000 versus 10,000 versus 5-foot views goes a long way towards streamlining your organization and helping people know who to ask when they need a decision at one of those levels.
And I think you've articulated that better than I've heard a lot of other people talk about, the dichotomy of mindset that's required to be a strategic thinker versus a tactical or operational thinker. That's really important, I think, and I want to emphasize that to the listeners here, that it's very difficult to switch back and forth between what am I going to do 6 months from now to how am I going to solve the problem that's going to the fire that somebody just brought to me, right? Once you put the fire out, then you can go back to the long-term thinking. But that switching, if you have to do that a lot of times during the day, that can be very, very taxing. And I'd be willing to bet, I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but my guess is that the people that can do the short-term stuff are not necessarily the best people to do your long-term stuff.
Often I find that's the case, although even when you do have the folks who are very good at the context, at both in both contexts, I have not yet met anyone who's good at switching contexts rapidly on those time horizons.
Right.
The
Yeah.
other distinction I would make is between the people with the vision of the sort of the results vision versus the implementation vision, because that's another major trap I tend to see roles falling into is they will put full responsibility for setting the outcomes and delivering the outcomes on a single person, and absolutely those people exist. However, my experience has been that most people either excel in really thinking about the results in that sort of classic visionary approach, or they're really strong in, okay, I see what you're saying. Now I know how to get there. So being able to create that vision or implement that vision, both can be incredibly strategic, but they tend to be very different strategic skill sets.
Right. I mean, that's exactly the point of the book Rocket Fuel, the Gino Wickman's follow up to Traction. Right. Was
Right.
the visionary versus the integrator. Right.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, and that's what I actually last year gave a TEDx talk and pulled the comparison back to the Archimedes quote about with a long enough lever, I can move the world, except it's a long enough lever and a strong enough pivot point. And we tend to focus just on the lever or those visionaries. We forget about the fact that you need the pivot point if you want any leverage for that idea.
that's really interesting. As a physicist, I'm fascinated by this. So talk more about that fulcrum. Talk more about the pivot point.
Yeah, so the fulcrum, I'm drawing that parallel to the implementers in an organization. I will say it is often easier to have one really powerful visionary can often support a much larger organization than one really compelling implementer. There tends to be a larger pool of people. Um, but if we don't recognize the need for both, right? If you have a truly amazing set of implementers, without that lever, they're just kind of sitting around waiting to put all that incredible power towards something amazing. On the other hand, a visionary who does not have that implementation support really does remind me of a lever without a fulcrum. It's a stick. It lies there and it might be beautiful and have incredible potential, but it is not gonna do anything. And so really one of the, I keep talking about traps because I see this all the time, but in org design, it becomes really easy to heavily weight your senior roles around the visionaries and those people who can really beautifully articulate and bring people along on these incredible outcomes. And you have to make space for your implementers as well to have that growth path and have that voice, or you run the risk of having too many dreams and too few results.
Right. And I'm guessing, maybe you can tell me, but I'm guessing that one of the reasons that the CEO tends to want to hire too many visionaries is because he or she tends to be a visionary.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
they value those skills and they communicate better with those kinds of people than they do with people who actually get stuff done.
And vice versa.
Yeah,
I find
sure.
myself I'm naturally more of an implementer fulcrum type, and I will say as a solopreneur, right, as someone building up a business, it has been a real struggle for me to get that high level vision articulated, and to find that that skill set in myself. And so I can only imagine the opposite, right? If I had that beautiful vision and no idea what the heck step one or two or eight was, you teamwork is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
I will say that.
Yeah. My my struggle always was I'm a visionary, right? And I can tell you all of the steps, but after 4 or 5 steps, I get bored.
Hmm.
It's time to move on. Um, and so, completion of projects, whether it's, business things or around the house, ask my wife. Um, it tends stuff tends to get to 80%, and that's close enough. Um,
Yeah,
so
I mean, the other dimension of that I don't have fitting quite as neatly into my levers and fulcrums metaphor is the avoidance of major issues. And so this is something near and dear to my heart with a systems engineering background. In many ways, effective systems engineering and successful systems engineering is about the catastrophes that never happened.
Right.
Uh, and that is very difficult to articulate, to measure, to get people excited about. And that is another skill set that I think is, a lot of leaders really struggle with systematizing and building into their organizations, finding ways to recognize and reward the people who prevented the fires instead of emphasizing and highlighting those who put out the fires. I don't know if you've read the latest. Bob Sutton was a co-author on the Friction Project, and that book has a
Oh, yeah.
beautiful
I haven't read.
articulation.
Yeah. I'll have to read that. I know Bob. Um, I took some classes with him at Stanford. So yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so that is really, it was something we always struggled with in corporate. And, my corporate career was, there's people that their organizations just ran flawlessly. The people who had troubles and were always putting out fires, those were the people that tended to get rewarded and put forward. And the other thing that was interesting, I'll say this because I have two daughters. Um, it tended to be the female-led organizations that were better at anticipating the fires and not having them, better at planning, better at being careful. I know that sounds sexist, but the data was pretty clear.
And there's
Um,
clear trends in the research around behaviors that female leaders are rewarded for over male leaders, right? Male leaders tend to be more rewarded when they are clearly decisive and limit their input seeking, whereas female leaders tend to be rewarded for soliciting broader uh, swaths of input before making decisions. And so I don't care if it's nature or nurture, it has been deeply socialized to set women up for some of those successes, whether or not we then recognize them down the line.
yeah, yeah. So that's really interesting. Because the other thing, of course, I've been a certified facilitator of the Covey 7 Habits for like 25 years. And one of the things that Dr. Covey emphasized in his time management matrix was the value of quadrant 2, which is that's the planning, right? You avoid things in quadrant 1, the crisis or the emergencies, by doing a good job in quadrant 2.
I use the phrase go slow to go fast so
Mhm.
often with my clients. It sometimes you go slow and you go slow, and those are not ideal circumstances, but far more often than I think people appreciate, if what you really want is to go fast, you have to start slow.
Yeah, and careful planning will, and asking yourself, well, what can go wrong? What are the things that based on your experience, team, what are the things that, what are we missing? Right?
Yeah.
It's a really powerful, yeah. So tell me, I know you have a book. Tell me about the book.
It's interesting you mentioned Stephen Covey. Seven Habits of a Highly Effective Team is one of the narrative business books that actually inspired my book. It's called Generation Innovation, Family, Business, Family, and the Journey to Success. And my co-author and I love narrative business books, the books that teach us about elements of business through a story that really engages us with the characters. What we could not find was a book that really covered the basics. The narrative business genre seemed to really focus in on these kind of more advanced concepts, whether it's in the goal or perform to win or seven habits. It sort of assumes this baseline, you're established, you kind of know what you're doing, but there's something complex that you need a story to help really bring home. And so we said, let's help those folks who don't want to read the textbooks for the early stuff. And so we wrote a story about a mother and a daughter. The mother has a dental practice and is getting to the age of considering retirement. The daughter is just starting a new tech based company that has some ties to the real world, to add complexity. It's a moving company. And turns out that with these very different businesses, these very different generations, there are quite a few business concepts that are directly relevant, important, and valuable to them both. So as we follow them through the book, they have a lot of advice and insights to share for each other as they both tackle challenges like, how do you define accountability? How do you just make decisions around your sales, your marketing? Does the Pareto principle apply? All that good stuff.
That's great. That sounds like a fascinating read. So
We had a
thanks.
lot of fun writing it.
Yeah, I'll bet. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to reach out?
So the two best ways to reach me are either through my website, which is belleviewconsulting.com, and it's BELLE like my name, and then VIEW because it's my perspective on the world, consulting, or on LinkedIn, and I'm Belle K. Walker on LinkedIn to find me easily. And then the book is on Amazon.
Great. And that concludes our show. Thanks to my guest, Belle Walker, the founder and CEO of Belleview Consulting. I hope you learned something about the importance of structure and process for a scalable and sustainable growth. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.